She woke up in a stranger's cabin wearing a wedding ring. He said they'd been married 3 years. Before we dive in, please support by subscribing and comment where you are watching from. The first thing Clara noticed was the pain. Her head throbbed like someone had hit her with a hammer. Her mouth was dry. And when she tried to open her eyes, the light streaming through a nearby window felt like knives stabbing into her brain. She groaned and tried to sit up. Big mistake. The room spun violently. Her stomach lurched. She collapsed back onto the pillow and waited for the world to stop tilting. Where was she? Clara forced her eyes open again. Slower this time. She was lying in a bed. A large, comfortable bed with clean white sheets and a thick quilt. The room around her was unfamiliar. Log walls. A stone fireplace. Simple furniture that looked handmade but well crafted. This wasn't her room. This wasn't her father's house in town. Panic started to rise in her chest. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a nightgown. Not hers. Someone had changed her clothes. The thought made her skin crawl. Then she noticed her left hand. There was a ring on her finger. A simple gold band. A wedding ring. Clara stared at it like it was a snake that had wrapped itself around her finger. She didn't own a wedding ring. She wasn't married. She was 24 years old and very much unmarried. So why was she wearing this? She tried to remember how she'd gotten here. The last thing she remembered was leaving her father's house yesterday morning. No, wait, was it yesterday? How long had she been unconscious? She'd been going to town. To the general store. Her father had asked her to pick up supplies. She remembered hitching the wagon, climbing onto the seat, starting down the road. And then nothing. Just blank emptiness where her memory should be. Clara's heart was pounding now. She needed to get out of here. Find out where she was. Get help. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold under her bare feet. She stood up slowly, testing her balance. The room swayed a little, but she managed to stay upright. Good. She could walk. She took a step toward the door, then another. She was halfway across the room when she heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots on wooden floorboards. The door opened. A man walked in carrying a tray with food and water. He was tall, probably in his late 20s, with dark brown hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore simple ranch clothes. Work pants, a cotton shirt, boots. When he saw Clara standing there, he stopped. A smile spread across his face. Not threatening, just warm. Like he was genuinely happy to see her awake. Clara backed away from him. Her hand instinctively went to her throat. Where was her dress? Her shoes? How did she defend herself in a nightgown? The man set the tray down on a small table near the bed. He held up both hands in a peaceful gesture. He told her not to be afraid. His voice was deep, calm. He said she was safe. That she'd been unconscious for 2 days and he'd been worried. Clara's voice came out as a croak. She asked who he was, where she was, what had happened to her. The man's smile faded. He looked confused, concerned. He asked if she was feeling all right, if her head still hurt. Clara demanded answers. She wanted to know what was going on, why she was here, why she was wearing someone else's clothes. The man took a step closer. Clara took a step back. She told him to stay away from her. He stopped immediately. Worry creased his forehead. He said her name. Clara. He asked if she remembered him. Clara's blood went cold. How did this stranger know her name? She told him she'd never seen him before in her life. She asked again who he was and what he'd done to her. The man went very still. His face paled. He asked her what year she thought it was. The question was so strange it threw Clara off balance. She told him it was 1877, September. Why was he asking such an odd question? The man sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. He ran his hand through his hair. He looked like someone had just punched him in the gut. He told her his name was Thomas. Thomas Brennan. And according to every legal document in the territory, he was her husband. They'd been married for 3 years. The room seemed to tilt again. Clara grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. She told him that was impossible. She wasn't married. She'd never been married. Thomas stood up slowly. He walked to a dresser on the far side of the room and pulled out a piece of paper. He brought it to her carefully, like he was approaching a spooked horse. It was a marriage certificate. Clara took it with shaking hands and read it. Clara Elizabeth Carter married to Thomas James Brennan. Date: June 15, 1874. 3 years ago. Signed by a justice of the peace. Witnessed by 2 people whose names she didn't recognize. Her signature was at the bottom. It looked like her handwriting. But she had no memory of signing this. No memory of this wedding. No memory of this man. Clara looked up at Thomas. She told him this had to be a mistake. Some kind of forgery. She would remember getting married. Thomas asked her what the last thing she remembered was. Clara thought hard. She told him about leaving her father's house. About going to town for supplies. That was yesterday morning. Thomas shook his head. He told her that wasn't yesterday. That was 3 years ago. The last normal day she remembered was from 1874. It was now October of 1877. She'd lost 3 years of her life. Clara's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the chair. This couldn't be real. People didn't just lose 3 years of memory. That wasn't possible. But the marriage certificate was real. The unfamiliar cabin was real. The ring on her finger was real. And this man, this Thomas Brennan, was looking at her with such genuine concern and confusion that Clara found herself believing he wasn't lying. He truly thought they were married. Clara asked what had happened to her. Why couldn't she remember anything? Thomas sat back down on the bed. He explained that 2 days ago, she'd been riding their horseback from a neighbor's ranch. The horse had spooked, thrown her. She'd hit her head hard on a rock. He'd found her unconscious, brought her home. The doctor had come and examined her, said she had a bad concussion, that she needed rest, that she'd wake up when she was ready. But the doctor hadn't said anything about memory loss. Clara touched the back of her head gingerly. There was a lump there. Tender, bandaged. She asked Thomas to prove they were married, beyond just a piece of paper. If they'd been together for 3 years, he should know things about her. Personal things. Thomas nodded. He understood. He told her that her full name was Clara Elizabeth Carter Brennan now. That her father was William Carter, a shopkeeper in Cedar Ridge. That she had no siblings. That her mother had died when Clara was 12. All true. But those were things anyone in town might know. Thomas continued. He said Clara loved to read. That her favorite book was Jane Eyre and she'd read it so many times the pages were falling out. That she hated coffee but loved tea with honey. That she had a small scar on her left knee from falling out of a tree when she was 8. That she hummed when she cooked and didn't even realize she was doing it. Clara stared at him. Those weren't public knowledge. Those were intimate details. Things a husband would know. She lifted the hem of her nightgown slightly. There was the scar on her knee. Exactly where he said it would be. Thomas stood and walked to a bookshelf in the corner. He pulled out a worn copy of Jane Eyre and brought it to her. The spine was cracked. Pages were dog-eared. Her name was written inside the front cover in her own handwriting. Clara's hands were shaking as she held the book. This was hers. She recognized it. But she didn't remember bringing it here. Didn't remember living in this cabin. Didn't remember this man. She asked Thomas to tell her about their wedding. What she wore. Who was there. Every detail he could remember. Thomas sat back down. He looked sad now. Like he was mourning something. He told her they'd gotten married at the church in Cedar Ridge. Small ceremony. Just Clara's father, the preacher, and 2 witnesses. Clara had worn her mother's wedding dress. It was cream-colored with lace sleeves. She'd carried wildflowers because they couldn't afford fancy roses. After the ceremony, they'd come here to the ranch. It was his family's land. 500 acres in the mountains with a creek running through it. He raised cattle and horses. Clara had helped him build up the ranch over the past 3 years. He said she'd been happy. That they'd been happy. That she'd told him just last week that this was the best decision she'd ever made. And now she couldn't remember any of it. Clara felt tears burning in her eyes. This was impossible. Terrifying. She'd lost 3 entire years. 3 years of her life had just vanished. And everyone was telling her she'd been married to a complete stranger during that time. She asked Thomas why she would have married him. They must have courted first. How had they met? Thomas explained that her father had hired him to do some repairs on his shop 3 years ago. Thomas had been new to town. Just bought the ranch and was looking to establish himself. He and Clara had met when she brought him lunch while he worked. They'd talked, found they had things in common. He'd asked permission to court her. Her father had approved. They'd courted for 2 months before Thomas proposed. Clara had said yes. They'd married a month later. It sounded reasonable. Normal. The kind of story hundreds of couples probably had. But Clara had no memory of any of it. She asked Thomas if she could see her father. If William Carter could come here and confirm this was all real. Thomas's face fell. He looked down at his hands. He told her that her father had died 2 years ago. Heart failure. Quick and painless. Clara had been devastated. She'd grieved for months. The funeral had been the only time Thomas had ever seen her cry. Clara felt like she'd been hit again. Her father was dead? She had no memory of his death. No memory of grieving him. No memory of saying goodbye. She started crying. Not gentle tears. Huge, gulping sobs that shook her whole body. Thomas moved toward her instinctively, then stopped. He asked if he could comfort her, if she wanted him to. Clara shook her head. She couldn't let a stranger touch her, even if everyone said he was her husband. Thomas stepped back, respected her boundary, but his face showed how much it hurt him. He told her he'd give her time, space, whatever she needed, but he wanted her to know that he loved her, that they had built a real life together, that even if she couldn't remember right now, maybe the memories would come back. Clara couldn't speak through her tears. She just sat there, crying for a father she couldn't remember losing. For a life she couldn't remember living. For 3 years that had been stolen from her. Thomas quietly left the room, closed the door behind him, left her alone with her grief and confusion. Clara cried until she had no tears left. Then she sat in the chair, staring at the marriage certificate and the ring on her finger, trying to make sense of the impossible. She was married to a stranger. Her father was dead. 3 years of her life were gone. And somewhere in this cabin, in this life she couldn't remember, were answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask yet. Clara spent the rest of the day alone in the cabin bedroom. Thomas had left a tray of food outside her door. Soup, bread, fresh water. She ate mechanically, not tasting anything. Her mind was too busy spinning. She examined every detail of the room, searching for clues about this life she supposedly lived. The bookshelf held dozens of volumes. Many showed signs of heavy reading. Jane Eyre wasn't the only worn copy. There was also Pride and Prejudice, Wuthering Heights, poems by Emily Dickinson. All books Clara loved. All books she'd read multiple times before her memory loss. The dresser held clothes that fit her perfectly. Simple day dresses in muted colors. Work shirts. A beautiful emerald green dress that looked expensive. The kind of dress a woman might wear to important occasions. On the dresser sat a wooden brush and comb. A small mirror. A photograph in a tarnished silver frame. Clara picked it up with trembling hands. It showed her standing next to Thomas. They were outside. The cabin visible behind them. Clara's arm was linked through his. She was smiling. Actually smiling. Like she was genuinely happy. She wore a simple blue dress. Thomas wore his ranch clothes. His arm was around her waist protectively. They looked like a couple who loved each other. But Clara had no memory of this moment. No memory of standing next to this man. No memory of feeling whatever happiness she was displaying in the photograph. She set it down carefully. Her hands were shaking. As evening fell, Clara heard sounds from outside. Horses. A man's voice calling out to someone. The sounds of ranch work winding down for the day. Thomas was out there. Working. Living his life. While she sat in this bedroom trying to accept that 3 years had passed without her knowledge. Around sunset, there was a soft knock on the bedroom door. Clara told whoever it was to come in. Thomas entered carrying a fresh pitcher of water and more food. He set them down on the small table. He asked if Clara was feeling any better. If her headache had improved. Clara said her head still hurt, but not as badly as this morning. The physical pain was nothing compared to the mental confusion. Thomas nodded. He said the doctor had warned that headaches would continue for a few days. That rest was the best medicine. He paused at the foot of the bed. His expression was carefully neutral. Like he was trying very hard not to show how much he was hurting. He told Clara that he understood this was overwhelming. That she didn't have to accept anything right now. That he would sleep in the main room. Give her space. Clara asked if he'd been sleeping in the main room since she woke up. Thomas said yes. When the doctor said she had a concussion and needed to rest, he'd moved out. He wanted her to be comfortable. Something about that struck Clara as honorable. Even through her confusion and fear, she recognized that this man was trying to treat her with respect, giving her space when she clearly didn't want him near her. She asked him what their life had been like before the accident, when she could remember. Thomas pulled up a chair and sat down. Not too close, just close enough to talk without raising his voice. He told her that mornings on the ranch started early. Before dawn, he'd go out to check the cattle and horses. Clara would stay in the house. She'd make breakfast. She liked to sing while she cooked. After breakfast, Thomas would work on ranch business. Mending fences, doctoring sick animals, managing the herd. Clara would do household chores. But she also helped with the ranch work. She was better with the horses than Thomas was. The animals seemed to trust her. She'd named half of them. Talked to them like they were people. In the afternoons, when the work was slower, Clara would often ride out to check on the southern pasture. That's where she'd been yesterday. Checking on a horse that had been favoring its front leg. On quiet evenings, they'd sit on the porch. Clara would read while Thomas worked with leather or wood. They'd talk about their plans. They wanted to expand the herd. Maybe build a bigger house next year. Clara had talked about wanting a garden. Growing vegetables. Flowers too. She'd said it would be nice to have beauty around the property. Not just functionality. Thomas said he'd told her he'd build whatever she wanted. That he'd do anything to make her happy. Clara listened to this description of her own life. It sounded peaceful. Contented. Like she'd been building something real with this man. But it also sounded like the life of someone else. Someone Clara didn't remember being. She asked Thomas if they loved each other. The question seemed to hit him hard. His jaw tightened. He looked away. He told her yes. They loved each other. He loved her. And she loved him. Clara asked how he knew that. If it was possible for her to have loved him and then just forgotten all of it. Thomas said yes. It was possible. Memory loss didn't erase actual feelings. It just made you forget the evidence of those feelings. He told her that the night before yesterday, before her accident, Clara had told him she loved him. They'd been lying in bed. She'd said that buying this ranch and marrying him had been the best decision she'd ever made. He said she'd kissed him. Told him she was grateful for their life together. And then yesterday she'd been thrown from a horse and lost 3 years of memories. Thomas's voice cracked slightly when he finished speaking. Clara felt a rush of sympathy for him. This man claimed to love her, claimed she loved him. And now she was a stranger in her own home, a stranger in her own marriage. It was cruel. To both of them. She asked Thomas to tell her more, about specific memories, things only a real husband would know. Thomas told her about their wedding night, how nervous she'd been, how gentle he'd tried to be, how she'd cried afterward, not from pain, from happiness, from relief that she'd chosen right. He told her about the time Clara had gotten sick with a fever, how Thomas had sat beside her bed for 3 days straight, how she'd called out his name in her sleep, how when the fever broke, she'd told him she'd been dreaming about him the whole time. Even unconscious, her mind had been calling for him. He told her about the day she'd told him she wanted to marry him. It had been raining. They'd been caught in it during a ride. They'd taken shelter in a small cave. And in the darkness and the sound of rain, she'd said she didn't want to wait anymore. She wanted to be his wife. His partner. Forever. With each memory, Clara felt something shift inside her. Not full recognition, but a kind of emotional echo. Like her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. She asked Thomas if they'd been happy. He told her yes, they'd been very happy. They still could be, once she recovered. Clara said she wasn't sure about that, that 3 years was a long time, that he might be remembering things differently than they actually happened. Thomas shook his head. He told her he knew what he felt, knew what they had together was real. Clara told him she needed time, that she couldn't just accept this and move on. Thomas said he understood. He told her to take all the time she needed, that he wasn't going anywhere. He stood and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. He told her that he knew this was hard, that he was sorry she was suffering, but he wanted her to know that he'd never hurt her, that he'd spend the rest of his life proving that to her if that's what it took. Then he left. Clara sat alone in the growing darkness. Outside, she could hear him moving around, putting things away, settling in for the night in the main room. She looked at the marriage certificate again, at the photograph, at the wedding ring on her finger. Slowly, carefully, she tried to construct a narrative in her head, a story of these 3 missing years, of meeting Thomas, falling in love, getting married, building a life together on this ranch. It felt like trying to remember a dream. The more she grasped for it, the more it slipped away. But something was there, some kind of feeling, buried deep beneath the fear and confusion. Clara wasn't sure if it was memory or just her mind trying to make sense of the impossible. Either way, she knew she couldn't stay locked in this room forever. She needed answers. She needed to figure out who she'd been for the past 3 years. And maybe, just maybe, figure out if she wanted to go back to that woman, or if she wanted to become someone completely different. The next morning, Clara woke with a determination she hadn't felt since the accident. She needed to get out of this bedroom. She needed to see the ranch, the house, everything that supposedly made up her life with Thomas. She found clean clothes in the dresser, a simple brown dress that fit perfectly, boots that her feet slipped into like they'd been broken in by her own steps, though she had no memory of wearing them. When she emerged from the bedroom, Thomas was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. He looked up, surprised. He asked if she was feeling well enough to get up. Clara told him yes. She said she needed to see this place, needed to understand what her life had become. Thomas nodded. He said he'd show her around after they ate. Breakfast was quiet. Clara picked at eggs and toast. She couldn't eat much. Her stomach was still twisted with anxiety. But she watched Thomas, observed the way he moved, the careful way he ate, as if he was trying not to make her nervous, the way his eyes kept darting to her face, checking on her. He did seem to care about her welfare. That much seemed genuine. After breakfast, Thomas led her outside. The cabin was larger than Clara had realized. A main room with kitchen and living space, 2 bedrooms, a covered porch that wrapped around the front. Behind the cabin stood a large barn, a corral with 3 horses. Further away, Clara could see pasture land stretching out to distant mountains. It was beautiful. She had to admit that. The kind of place someone might want to build a life. Thomas explained the layout of the ranch. He pointed out the water source, a small creek that ran year-round. He showed her the south pasture where he kept most of the cattle, the north pasture, which was set aside for breeding stock. He showed her a spot near the cabin where he'd started building a larger house. The foundation was already laid. He said they'd planned to start construction this spring. Clara asked if she'd been consulted about the design. Thomas smiled. A real smile. He said Clara had drawn the plans herself. She'd spent weeks sketching it out. He had the drawings inside if she wanted to see them. They walked around the property, Thomas pointing out things that apparently mattered to Clara. A particular rock formation where she liked to sit and read. A grove of aspen trees where she'd said she wanted to have picnics. A spot near the creek where Thomas had promised to build her a small shelter for summertime. It was all very intimate, very personal. The kind of details a man would know if he'd spent 3 years with a woman. But as Clara listened, something began to feel off. She asked Thomas a question. She asked him what color her eyes were. Thomas told her they were brown, warm brown, like autumn leaves. Clara asked him to describe the scar on her left knee, the one he'd mentioned yesterday. Thomas described it accurately, about an inch long, on the inside of her knee, from a childhood accident. She asked him what she was wearing the day they met. Thomas hesitated. He said she was wearing a green dress. No, wait, yellow. He wasn't entirely sure. It had been 3 years. Clara asked him another question. She asked what her father's name was. Thomas said it was William. William Carter. Clara asked what his middle name was. Thomas paused. He said he couldn't remember, that he'd heard it before but it didn't stick in his memory. Clara kept asking questions, rapid fire, testing him. What was her mother's name? What year was she born? What was her favorite flower? What was her most embarrassing memory? Thomas answered what he could, but Clara could see the cracks forming, could see him filling in details where his memory was fuzzy, making educated guesses based on what he thought he knew about her. Finally, Clara asked him the most important question. She asked him to describe their wedding night, in detail, everything he remembered. Thomas's face flushed. He said that was private, that it wasn't appropriate for him to discuss such intimate matters. Clara pushed harder. She said if they were really married, he should be able to tell her, that she needed to know if he truly remembered or if he was just telling her a story. Thomas looked away. He told her they'd been nervous. It had been her first time. His too. They'd been gentle with each other. And it had been beautiful. That was all. He wouldn't say more. Clara stepped closer to him. She asked him if he could remember specific details. Where they'd been. What the room looked like. What she'd said to him. Thomas's jaw clenched. He told her he wasn't going to discuss this. That it was disrespectful to her memory. Even if she couldn't remember it herself. Clara said that wasn't an answer. That a real husband would remember. Would be able to describe intimate details with accuracy. Thomas turned to face her. His expression was pained. He told her that he had told her the truth. But he understood why she didn't believe him. That if positions were reversed, he wouldn't believe her either. He said that 3 years ago, Clara had been a stranger to him too. That he'd fallen in love with her slowly. Through getting to know her. Through spending time with her. Through the small moments that made up a life together. He said that he'd never force her to accept his version of their past. That the memories were his, not hers. And she had to build her own understanding of who she'd been and who she wanted to become. Thomas told her that he was going to ride out to the south pasture to check on the cattle. That she could explore the house. Look through whatever she wanted. Find proof or disproof of his story. He said when he came back, they could talk more. But he wouldn't lie to her anymore. He left Clara standing in the yard, mounted a horse and rode away toward the distant pasture. Clara stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. Then she went back inside the cabin. She found the drawings Thomas had mentioned, a stack of papers in a desk in the main room. Architectural sketches for a 2-story house with multiple rooms. Large windows. A wrap-around porch. The handwriting on the sketches was her own. She recognized it immediately. But she had no memory of drawing them. She found a journal in the bedroom dresser. The entries were in her handwriting. Dates going back 3 years. The earliest entries were dated just after her supposed wedding. She read her own words describing her wedding day. Describing the ceremony. The church. Thomas standing at the altar looking nervous and hopeful. She read about their first days on the ranch. About discovering what hard work ranching actually entailed. About aching muscles and sunburned skin. She read about falling in love. Slowly, then all at once. About recognizing when Thomas had become more important to her than her own comfort. She read about her father's death. The grief was palpable even on the page. The way she described Thomas holding her while she cried. Staying with her through the long nights when grief wouldn't let her sleep. Clara read entries about plans they'd made. Dreams they'd discussed. A future they were building together. Every entry was in her own handwriting. Every entry described a life she couldn't remember living. By the time Thomas came back from checking the cattle, Clara had read 3 years of her own words. And she was crying. Thomas found her on the porch, the journal open on her lap. He asked if she'd found what she was looking for. Clara looked up at him. She asked if the memories were real. If she'd actually written these things. Felt these things. Thomas said yes. They were real. Everything in that journal was something she'd experienced and felt deeply enough to write down. Clara told him that she'd lost 3 years of her life. That there was a part of her that felt like those years belonged to someone else. That the woman who wrote those journal entries wasn't the same woman sitting on this porch. Thomas sat down beside her. Not touching her, just sitting. He told her that loss and change were part of being alive. That the Clara from 3 years ago wasn't the same Clara as today either. That people grew and changed. That who she'd been and who she was now were both valid versions of herself. He said that her accident had forced her to confront her own life as if she was meeting it for the first time. And maybe that was a gift. Maybe it gave her the chance to choose who she wanted to be next. Clara asked him what he wanted her to choose. Thomas looked out at the ranch, at the mountains beyond, at the life they'd supposedly built together. He told her that he wanted her to be happy. That was all that mattered to him, whether that happiness included him or not. Clara felt something break open inside her chest, because she could hear in his voice that he meant it, that he genuinely cared more about her well-being than about his own desires. She asked him how long it would take for her to remember everything. Thomas said the doctor hadn't given a timeline. That memory could return gradually, or it might never fully come back. Clara asked what she should do in the meantime. Thomas suggested that she start small. Walk the ranch every day. Reacquaint herself with the place. Look through her journal. Let the memories come back naturally if they were going to. He said that he would stay out of her way. Give her space, but that he was always there if she needed him. Clara nodded. She told him that she was scared, that she didn't know how to be a wife to someone when she couldn't remember being in love with him. Thomas said that was all right, that love could be rebuilt, that sometimes it was even stronger the second time around because you built it with intention instead of accident. Clara looked at the journal in her hands, at the marriage certificate she'd tucked inside the front cover, at the wedding ring on her finger. She asked Thomas if he could give her one more piece of proof, something that would help her believe. Thomas asked what she wanted. Clara asked him to tell her the story of how they'd met, word for word, as accurately as he could remember. Thomas settled back in his chair, and he began to speak. He told her about the day he'd come to her father's shop to do repairs, about how she'd brought him lunch, how she'd sat with him while he ate, how they'd talked for hours about books and life and dreams. The more he talked, the more Clara found herself listening not to his words, but to the emotion behind them, the genuine affection, the real memory of someone he'd clearly loved. By the time he finished, the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold. Clara realized she was leaning toward him, that her fear had eased, replaced by something else, curiosity maybe, or the beginning of trust. She asked him if he could give her time, to process everything, to figure out who she was now. Thomas told her that he would give her all the time she needed. Clara stood. She told him she was going to go rest, that all this confusion had given her a headache again. Thomas said that was wise, that her body needed time to heal. As Clara turned to go inside, she paused. She turned back to Thomas. She asked him his middle name, the one he couldn't remember earlier when she asked about her father. Thomas told her it was Michael. Thomas Michael Brennan. Clara nodded. She said it quietly to herself, getting used to how it sounded. Thomas Michael Brennan, her supposedly beloved husband. Then she went inside to rest, leaving Thomas alone on the porch as the stars began to come out. Over the next week, Clara established a routine. She would wake early, dress in the simple clothes that fit her perfectly, even though she couldn't remember owning them. She would eat breakfast with Thomas, and they would talk about the weather, the cattle, the work that needed to be done around the ranch. It was safe conversation. It didn't require her to remember or feel anything she wasn't ready to feel. After breakfast, Thomas would leave to work on the ranch. Clara would spend her days exploring the cabin, reading through her journal entries, walking the property. Slowly, the place began to feel less like a stranger's house and more like somewhere she might belong. The journal entries were helping. Reading her own words from 3 years ago was like listening to a ghost tell her story. She could hear her own voice in the writing, her own thoughts, her own feelings. She read about the day she and Thomas had gone riding and gotten caught in a rainstorm, about taking shelter in a cave, about kissing him for the first time in that darkness, about how her heart had felt like it might burst out of her chest. She read about the day Thomas had proposed, how he'd asked her father's permission first, how he'd done it on bended knee beside the very creek she could see from the cabin porch. She read about their wedding night, her own words describing nervousness and tenderness, describing a man who had been patient and gentle, describing feeling safe and loved for the first time in her life. The more Clara read, the more she understood that the woman who'd written these entries had loved Thomas deeply, had trusted him completely, had built a real life with him. But Clara still couldn't access those feelings directly. It was like watching someone else's memories play out on a screen. She could understand them intellectually, but emotionally, they belonged to a different person. On the 8th day after the accident, Clara was walking near the creek when she slipped on a wet rock. Her foot twisted beneath her. Pain shot through her ankle. She fell hard, hit her head on the same rock that had caused all this trouble in the first place. The world went black. When she woke up, she was back in the cabin bedroom. Thomas was sitting in a chair beside the bed, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Clara asked what had happened. Thomas told her that he'd been checking on her in the creek area, had found her unconscious, had brought her back to the cabin immediately. He said the doctor had come again, examined her, said she'd hit her head a second time, that it was a miracle she hadn't fractured her skull. Clara tried to sit up. Her head throbbed. Her ankle was bandaged and elevated on pillows. Thomas gently pushed her back down. He told her to rest, that she'd been unconscious for 4 hours. Clara asked what time it was. Thomas said it was evening, nearly dark outside. Clara closed her eyes. She felt exhausted, physically and emotionally. Then something strange happened. As she drifted toward sleep, fragments of memory began to surface. Not complete memories, just pieces, feelings. She remembered the smell of the cabin, leather and hay, and something distinctly Thomas. She remembered the sound of his voice calling out to ranch hands. She remembered the feeling of his hand on the small of her back as he guided her through a doorway. She remembered laughing about something she couldn't quite grasp, but she remembered the joy of it, the lightness, and she remembered love, not from her journal, not from his stories, but from somewhere deep inside herself. A bone-deep knowledge that she had loved this man. When morning came, Clara woke to find Thomas still sitting in the chair beside her bed. He'd fallen asleep there, his head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle. She studied his face in the morning light. The strong features, the dark hair falling across his forehead, the stubble on his jaw, and she recognized him. Not with a complete memory, but with a recognition that went deeper than memory. Her body knew him. Her heart knew him. Clara reached out carefully. She touched his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. Thomas woke immediately. His eyes opened. When he saw her touching him, his expression shifted, hope and fear warring on his face. Clara told him that she remembered something. Not everything, just a little bit. Thomas sat up straighter. He asked what she remembered. Clara said she remembered laughing with him. She remembered feeling safe. She remembered knowing that she loved him. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. He asked if she was sure, if it was a real memory or just something she'd constructed from their conversations. Clara said she didn't know, but it felt real. It felt true in a way that went beyond logic or evidence. She asked him to tell her again what his favorite thing about her was. Thomas didn't hesitate. He said it was her laugh. The way she laughed at things that weren't even that funny. The way it made the whole room brighter. Clara asked him to tell her what her favorite thing about him was. Thomas said he didn't know. That she'd never said it in words. Clara closed her eyes, and suddenly she remembered. She remembered telling him that her favorite thing was the way he looked at her. Like she was the most important thing in his entire world. Like her happiness mattered more to him than his own comfort. She opened her eyes. She told him that was it. That was her favorite thing about him. Thomas reached out slowly, asking permission with his eyes. Clara nodded. He took her hand gently, careful not to jostle her injured ankle. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. He told her that he didn't care if she never fully recovered her memories, that even if this was all she could remember, it was enough. It was more than enough. Clara squeezed his hand. She told him that she was scared, that she was still confused, that 3 years of her life were still essentially gone. Thomas said that was all right, that they could rebuild together, that they could create new memories to fill the space where the old ones had been. He asked her if she was willing to try. Clara looked at their joined hands, at the wedding ring on her finger, at the face of the man who had loved her through 3 years she couldn't remember. She told him yes, she was willing to try. Thomas smiled, the smile that transformed his whole face, the smile she'd seen in photographs but never quite understood until this moment. He told her that she should rest, that her body needed healing just as much as her mind did. But before he left the room, he bent down and kissed her forehead gently. He whispered that he loved her, that he always had, that he always would. And Clara believed him. Clara stood in the partially completed house, running her hand along the wooden beam of what would be the dining room. The construction had progressed quickly over the past 4 months. With Thomas supervising and a crew of local workers helping, they'd managed to get the framework up and the roof on before the winter weather made further progress difficult. It was beautiful. Exactly like the drawings Clara had made 3 years ago. Now those drawings were becoming real. Thomas came up behind her. He asked if she liked how it was turning out. Clara said she loved it, that it felt right, like she was building exactly what she'd always wanted. Thomas wrapped his arms around her from behind. He held her loosely, giving her space to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned back against his chest. Her memories still hadn't fully returned. There were still gaps. Entire conversations she couldn't recall. Days that were blank. Moments that Thomas could describe but that Clara couldn't access. But she no longer felt like a stranger in her own life. The piece-by-piece memory recovery had continued. Small moments returning. A conversation about books. A ride through the mountains. A quiet evening on the porch. Dancing in the kitchen while dinner cooked. Each memory that returned felt like a gift. A connection to the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. Kaya and Dakota had visited multiple times. Kaya was thrilled to see Clara. She'd brought food and companionship and the kind of female friendship that Clara found she desperately needed. Dakota was more reserved, but Clara had read in her journal that he was her friend, that she'd confided in him. So she'd made an effort to rebuild that friendship. Her father's friends from town had visited as well. They'd brought news and stories about William Carter, about the man Clara barely remembered but who had raised her alone after her mother's death. Thomas had filled in more gaps in her personal history. had told her stories about her father that made her laugh and cry in equal measure. The grief of losing him was still there, but it was different now. It was the grief of missing someone, not the shock of losing them for the second time. The townspeople had eventually stopped being suspicious of her. The accident had been witnessed by a neighbor who'd been passing by. Word had spread about what had happened, about how she'd hit her head, about the memory loss. Some of the gossip that had flourished turned sympathetic. Clara found herself treated less like a cautionary tale and more like a victim of tragedy. It helped that Thomas had been so openly devoted to her recovery, that he'd made no secret of his love and commitment. They were becoming known around the territory as a couple who had weathered an unusual crisis and emerged stronger for it. Clara turned in Thomas's arms. She looked up at him. She told him that she had something to tell him. Thomas asked what it was. His expression grew concerned. He wanted to know if everything was all right. Clara said everything was all right. Better than all right, actually. She told him that she was pregnant. Thomas's expression shifted. Shock. Joy. All of it playing across his face at once. He asked if she was certain. Clara said she'd gone to the doctor in town yesterday while Thomas was working. The doctor had confirmed it. She was about 3 months along. Thomas picked her up and spun her around, careful not to jostle her too roughly. When he set her down, he was laughing. Actually laughing. She'd heard it before, but this was the first time she'd heard it since her accident. It was a beautiful sound. He asked when she'd found out. Clara said this morning. She'd been waiting for the right moment to tell him. Thomas pulled her close. He held her like she was the most precious thing in his entire world. He whispered that he loved her, that their child would be loved, that everything was going to be all right. Clara rested her head on his chest. She listened to his heartbeat. Strong and steady. She still didn't remember everything. Probably never would. 3 years were still largely a blank to her. But she was learning that not all important things had to be remembered to be real. Not all love had to be rooted in the past to matter. She had built a life with Thomas Brennan. Even if she couldn't remember building it, the life was real. It was solid. It was good. And now they were going to build something new together. A family. A home. A future that belonged to both of them equally. Clara looked around the half-finished house again. She thought about the completion. About bringing a baby into these rooms. About creating memories that Thomas would help her remember if she ever forgot them again. She asked Thomas if he had any regrets. About getting stuck with a wife who couldn't remember 3 years of their marriage. Thomas pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. He told her that he had no regrets. That having her was worth every moment of confusion or pain. That the woman she was now was just as wonderful as the woman she'd been before. He said that love wasn't about perfect memory or flawless continuity. It was about choosing someone again and again. About building something together one day at a time. He said she'd chosen him this morning when she decided to tell him about the baby. She chose him every day when she woke up beside him and stayed. Clara felt tears forming. Happy tears. She asked him to promise that he would tell their child stories. About Clara before the accident. About the woman she'd been. So the child would know the whole story of who their mother was. Thomas promised. He said he would tell their child everything. The good parts and the hard parts. The beginning and all the chapters that came after. Clara kissed him then. Really kissed him. Not tentatively. Not carefully. But with the full weight of recognition and love and commitment. Thomas responded immediately. His hands moved to her waist. He kissed her back with the intensity of a man who'd been given a second chance. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Thomas asked if she remembered this. If she had any memory of kissing him before the accident. Clara said no. But she said it didn't matter. Because this kiss was new. This kiss was theirs. Made in the aftermath of loss and confusion and the slow rebuilding of trust. She said that maybe forgetting had been a gift. That it had forced them to rebuild their relationship consciously. To choose each other again from scratch. That maybe their love was stronger now because it had been tested. Because it had survived not just absence but actual loss of memory. Thomas held her close as the afternoon light filtered through the windows of their almost finished house. He told her that he believed that maybe their story wasn't about a woman who'd forgotten. Maybe it was about a woman who'd been given the chance to fall in love with the right man twice. Clara rested her head on his shoulder. She looked around the space that would become their home. This room. This house. This life they were building together. She still had gaps in her memory. Still had days and weeks and entire months that were closed off to her. But standing here with Thomas's arms around her, carrying his child, building a home together, she realized she didn't need to remember the past to have faith in the future. The past was what had brought them here. But the future was what they would create together. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.